Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Oh, I'm a working class lad. The reason that you put the milk in first is that it was usually off.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. This week, a step back from coronavirus. We're sure you're getting your fill of news elsewhere, and for just 1 week, we're hoping to bring you some respite. So I'm bringing you a special recording with a man who has an opinion on just about everything, even my interviewing technique. Last time he was on the podcast, David Starkey told me off for interrupting him. That's right, my guest is Dr David Starkey, and we recorded this interview a few weeks before the country went into lockdown. He is, I think, one of the most interesting and respected historians of the 21st century. He's written over a dozen books, presented history documentaries on the BBC, ITV and Channel 4. He's ruffled more than a few feathers on Question Time, and he's a familiar voice on BBC Radio 4. He's a Conservative voter, and he was vocal in his support for Brexit. He was awarded a CBE in 2007 for his services to history, but having achieved all of that, he says his greatest accolade is a former student once describing him as the least boring historian in Cambridge. David Starkey, welcome to Chopper's Politics. It's great to have you on. We've got some time to discuss things today, which I know you need, because last time you came on the podcast...
Are you suggesting I am verbose?
Well, I kept trying to make points, and you accused me of interrupting and to be quiet, which I was.
I was completely right.
You're right, yes,
Yeah.
you made better points than I could ever possibly make. And of course, we have got there with Brexit. Now, when we met, goodness, in the first week of November, you were very exercised by the way Parliament was behaving. Your point about Parliament is that it needs controlling. I wonder if you want to summarise where you are on that.
Yes. Remember, Chris, there's something very extraordinary. We genuinely have a constitution which is 800 years old. In other words, and this is as yet to get through to our Supreme Court, it can only be understood historically. And the key to understanding our Parliament, of course, is where it begins. It begins in the aftermath of Magna Carta in the 13th century, and Magna Carta, of course, opens the door to Parliament because it requires the king to ask for some form of consent before he raises taxation. This absolutely fundamental thing. And then you've got two founding fathers of Parliament. We go on endlessly about the people, the founding fathers of America. We should hear a bit more about our own founding fathers. They're pretty remarkable. And there are two of them in the 13th century, and they're absolute polar opposites. Indeed, one kills the other. The two founders of Parliament are, on the one hand, the great aristocratic rebel, Simon de Montfort, who is both a high aristocrat, he's the king's brother-in-law, he is French, his boo, and they're already, remember, distinguishing themselves from France even at this point. He's French, he is passionately religious, he is the first, and this is why he should figure as a kind of patron saint of what we're doing now. He is the first leader of a political movement in English history, of a political party. And he believes in Parliament, this developing body on the back of Magna Carta, that it should be fundamentally a limitation on the king. That phrase that you got perpetually in the judgment of the Supreme Court on prorogation, holding government to account. That's what he sees it as being. And he makes it doubly effective as that, because the earlier bodies that have been called Parliament, they'd just really been meetings of what is the ancestor of the House of Lords.
In the Abbey, weren't they? Met in the Abbey, I think.
They not so much in the Abbey itself as in the precinct, the chapter house, because remember, the Abbey is also part of the Royal Palace. There's this huge double precinct. It's remarkable. We're still governed from the same place. And the layers of royal palaces in London actually act as the name of the different aspects of our government. Westminster for Parliament, and later on Whitehall for the civil service, that of course being founded by Henry VIII. But going back to de Montfort, so you've got de Montfort then as a believer in limitation on government, and he creates the first representatives in English history. He summons representatives of the counties and the towns to sit in his parliament in 1265. When he's captured the royal family, he holds them prisoner. He's a dictator. He's a military dictator of England. A couple of years later, he is killed at the Battle of Evesham by his nemesis, by the Prince Edward. We'd say Prince. They then called him the Lord Edward, the future Edward I. And in those days, when you undergo political political defeat. Unlike Mr. Bercow, you don't debate about getting a peerage. You are killed and cut into four as a traitor. And many of us, I'm sure, would wish that fate on Mr. Bercow. But anyway, still.
You might disagree with that.
You passionately disagree. But Edward believes in Parliament as something else. He spots the opportunity to make Parliament not the means of holding the government to account, but the means of effective government. In other words, now you've got everybody in England, this wonderful legal phrase, represented in Parliament, either in person or by his representative. Therefore, if Parliament decides something, everybody's agreed it. What better way of changing the law? So Edward makes himself, when he becomes king, the first great legal reformer in English history, using early parliamentary statute, the famous parliamentary statutes of Westminster 1, 2 and 3, and all the rest of it. He also realises it's the most effective way of raising taxation. So he uses Parliament to raise taxation for his gigantic wars of conquest, imperial conquest, first against the Welsh, successful, and unfortunately not quite so successful against the Scots, otherwise we wouldn't be dealing with Nicola Sturgeon. So Parliament is these two things. It's this doubleness about Parliament. And you know what, Christopher? This is why the English Parliament survives. Parliament is useful. It's useful to the king. It's useful to government. Everywhere else in Europe, we think the English Parliament is unique. It's not. Every major and minor, tiny little duchies had in Europe in the Middle Ages had some sort of representative assembly, but they all die out or they are abolished. They're abolished because they get in the way. They stop government. The key to understanding the English Parliament is that it facilitates, it enables government. And if we're being a little bit technical now in terms of history, there are two different historical traditions of looking at the English Parliament. There is the classic way of looking at it, which are the great parliamentary historians, the great historians of the 19th century, who look at it essentially as this vehicle of opposition. And they present it as I said, as an intrinsic limitation on government. And that means they focus on one particular century. They focus on the 17th century. But then there is a new, they're called the Whig historians, headed by Lord Macaulay. The much better historians, the modern ones, headed by my old, alas, late friend, Conrad Russell, Bertrand Russell's youngest son, they're called the revisionists. And they recognise that Parliament is this double thing, and they focus on cooperation between the Crown and Parliament. And they see what happened in the 17th century, not as Parliament struggling to limit the government, but as a breakdown of communication between the two. And that seems to me to be the foundation of any proper understanding of Parliament, which, of course, is why things went so wildly wrong in the period between 2017 and 2019.
Because some people wrongly felt that it was a 17th century model.
They did. They all were modelling themselves on the 17th century. They were all looking at this, in fact, unique period. It's a unique period when relations between the Crown and Parliament break down, and they were deliberately modelling themselves on the behaviour of those parliamentarians. They were not only modelling behaviour, they were actually modelling acts of Parliament. I mean, the Act of Parliament that led fundamentally to the disaster of what I think the Telegraph called the zombie Parliament of 2017-2019 is the Act, the so-called Fixed-Term Parliament Act, but should be repealed tomorrow in a one-line bill. But what's extraordinary, there was an Act in 1641 that did exactly the same. And that Act, that the Parliament couldn't be dissolved without its own consent, is why you have the Civil War. It's exactly what we saw happening in 2017-2019.
Were we on the way to civil war last year?
We were on our way to, I don't think as much a civil war as a kind of shadow boxing. It was completely strange. It had no purchase in the country at large. Our government froze. I mean, it's astonishing. Absolutely nothing was done for 2 years. You look at the May government, poor May, trying to secure her legacy. It's a legacy of absolute...
A legacy is 2050 net zero carbon.
Well, that's another disaster. But it is essentially a legacy of utter nullity. Because, again, you see, it highlights something fundamental. If a parliament is not managed, it can't do anything. All those people, like Bercow, like Dominic Grieve, like
Letwin.
Ben, like Letwin, they all imagined that they were so extraordinary that they could imitate the Parliament, which took over from the King, the Long Parliament, but that required an outstanding leader. It required John Pym, he's the only figure ever to have managed a parliament from within. Otherwise, if you look at the way our government develops...
John Pym was not a speaker.
No, he was not. The speaker was Lenthal.
Because the speaker last year was used. I mean, John Bercow felt he may have a role to play.
Well, he was playing the same sort of role that Lenthal had done under Charles I, which is deliberately giving the Commons their head, deliberately, as it were, presenting himself as a kind of oppositionist figure. But not even he could actually lead the Commons. Of course, in America, where you have a constitution which derives from ours, Pelosi, as Speaker, acts as the leader of the Democrat group, the Democrat majority in the House of Representatives, and actually runs the show. We didn't take that decision. So we've now got to go back a step. We've got to look now at why and how this notion of parliamentary management survives. I suggest we park that for a minute, because I think we should put something bigger into place, because clearly between the 13th century and the 17th century, it doesn't demand, a serious professional historian to tell you. There are a lot of other centuries, the most important of which is the 16th, and that other supremely important figure in the history of Parliament, Henry VIII. And it's particularly important because, of course, the 16th century, although I'm afraid Ms. Mantell hasn't got round to agreeing to it yet, she'll come round eventually.
Have you read her books?
Of course not. I look at the documents. Why on earth should I be interested in fiction? Fiction, by definition, is not true. So,
but you may have fun picking holes in what she says is truth.
I have better things to do, dare it be said. But let's go back. There is Henry VIII and the first Brexit, because the Reformation begins not as a struggle about faith. This is really important. It begins as a struggle about jurisdiction, about England separating itself from a pan-European body that's got a single system of European law, a single central court, which is why Henry VIII is having to appeal to Rome for his divorce.
Was he the original Brexiteer, do you think?
He becomes original Brexiteer because it's exactly the same as the jurisdiction of the ECJ or the European Court on Human Rights. You have an appellate body outside your own country.
But it was a religious breach, though, wasn't it?
No, it becomes a religious breach. It begins entirely as a jurisdictional breach. Henry remains essentially Catholic, although he's a very funny sort of Catholic, and he doesn't believe in the Pope, but in crucial aspects of Catholic doctrine, he is pretty orthodox and right through, though many of the people who support him, like Cranmer and Cromwell, are not. But the break with Rome is the first Brexit, and it's really important to look at what that means. It means that we are the heirs of, I think, a unique tradition in Europe, a tradition which says we are different, we are separate, we are deliberately standoffish from that lot over there in the continent. In other words, this passionate notion of self-government. And it's remarkable how quickly this is established, and it's propaganda. It's brilliant, brilliant propaganda. So many of the great speeches in Shakespeare, the great John of Gaunt speech in Richard II about this land of England, this dear, dear land, this jewel set in a silver sea, all it's taken straight from Henry VIII's propaganda. I mean, Shakespeare, is like any good journalist. The moment he sees a phrase, he steals it.
Proto-Boris Johnson.
He is a proto-Boris Johnson. He is a great picker-up of unconsidered trifles of language. But what you're doing with that is you're establishing this sense of separateness. And it's fascinating. Even a few years later, by the time of Henry's daughter Mary, when you reintroduce Catholicism, the Catholics have to argue that England has a peculiar relationship to the Roman Church. And again, I think we've forgotten this. The peculiarity of English history and the peculiarity of the history of the empire. It's no accident that the American colonies aspire to self-government. It's no accident that after the American War of Independence is Britain's only great defeat. After that, the British Empire then looks at a new model through the Durham Report, starting off with Canada, in which it recognises that all the white settlements will eventually become self-governing. This is unique. It's his appetite for self-government.
So it's recognising it's in there, isn't it? Recognise that's innate in British people.
It's innate. I think it's innate, and I think that is one of the utter fundamentals of Brexit.
And the modern word is sovereignty. Now, that's what people talk about when they talk about Brexit, giving sovereignty from the European Court of Justice and giving people back their power. And that's why, is it not, that when the government was trying to stop people doing this in 2016, they were sort of saying, well, you'll be worse off. You know, they were firing the bullets in the wrong direction because most people felt, well, I can take being worse off for the sovereignty it will give us. And it goes back to this golden thread back to Henry VIII then, you think?
I think it does. I mean, and again, there are two big points to make about that. The first one is that the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, about which the Goves and the Greaves and the Bercows, mustn't get Grieve and Gove mixed up, the Greaves and the Bercows were making such a fuss. Parliamentary sovereignty is meaningless without national sovereignty. And when the Remainers were trying to use parliamentary sovereignty to undercut national sovereignty, that was, I think, literally an obscenity. I mean, it was a vile antithesis. It was a contradiction.
It made no sense. And the wrapper that we had for the past 35 years was the European Scrutiny Committee, which was this kind of wrapper that let Parliament scrutinise EU directives. 30% of all laws came from there. And you talked to Bill Cash, he's on this podcast a few times. It was just almost impossible to look at all the work coming at them. They just had to try and pick and choose.
It was
what
nodded
could you do?
through. It was 99% nodded through. So that's one aspect. But the other thing, I think, let's just have a quick word about how completely this was misunderstood by one side in the Brexit debate. And always, I think, the great question, Chris, is why on earth did the Brexiteers win? I mean, just look at it. You're the journalist. Apart from the Telegraph, virtually everybody was against them. The press was, the mainstream media were against them. The BBC was against them. The church trespassing as usual into politics, and of course forgetting the origins of the Church of England. Everybody. How on earth did the Brexiteers win and the Remainers lose? They did it because the Brexiteers understood the fundamental. They understood. It wasn't, I mean, immigration, yes, but it's above all this appetite for self-government. And also this sense that once the British people have decided something, that is it. You know, you may bully the French, you may bully the Dutch, you may bully particularly the Irish, but not the Brits. They won't take it. But the key thing is just how appalling the Remainers were, because this was an argument about value. And the Remainers, headed by George Osborne, presented it as an argument about money. In other words, they constantly were going on about, you'll be so much in the pound worse off, GDP will go down so much. In other words, it's a classic Oscar Wilde remark about people who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And no Remainer has ever comprehended this. None of them has ever been able to argue properly in terms of values.
And Theresa May never got that. I mean, I would say with the deal she offered, that shows she hadn't got it. And the deal,
none of them comprehended it. But I think it's most interesting that people like George Osborne, who thought of himself as a new Machiavelli, so fundamentally misunderstood the basis of the British people, and I think the basis of political discourse.
You haven't mentioned the Peasants' Revolt yet. Now, should you? Or is that an erroneous idea? That I used it on Twitter, David. I'm not sure you know about Twitter. I was on Twitter saying this is a Peasants' Revolt in the modern...
You needn't talk to me as though you're an elderly judge. I am quite familiar. I don't think it's I don't think it is a terribly good analogy. There have been lots and lots of popular revolts in English history, but I think that the thing that's peculiar. You see, the thing that's peculiar about the English Reformation is it's a top-down top-down reformation. It's a king-led reformation. And I think it's this that accounts for the enormous difference between the way England and Scotland voted. You see, it's always the Reformation. The Reformation in Scotland was completely different. It was an ordinary European-style Reformation. So people like John Knox and whatever, although we tend to think of him as a dreadful Scot, he in fact spends most of his time in England and Switzerland. It's a European Reformation. Ours isn't.
Is it an English thing we're talking about here rather than a Scottish
Absolutely
thing?
English. I mean,
because the Scots voted to remain. Of
the
course.
Scots vote to remain. And their political history, again, is concealed by this weird semi-union between England and Scotland of 1707. There is no such thing. I know my dear friend Simon Sharma spent many episodes doing a history of Britain. It does not exist. It really doesn't exist. We are unique in the great nations in never having forged a British nation. We are throughout four nations in one.
The Act of Union in 1707 exists.
The Act of Union exists, but we never forged a single nation. There were attempts at doing it. There were attempts at talking about Scotland as North Britain.
Yes.
You will actually find this.
The Victorians did that, didn't they?
The Victorians did. There's a wonderful. I remember I played Jack in The Importance of Being Earnest. There's a wonderful reference to Jack's three houses. One of which was the Sporran Feifsha NB, North Britain. But that didn't last. And there was a North British Hotel in Edinburgh, there was a North British Railway and whatever. That didn't last. And instead what you get in the 18th century is even the monarchy plays on the four separate nations. So all royal princes have got a Scottish title, an English title, an Irish title, now a Welsh title, and soon I'm sure an Isle of Man title and an Isle of Wight title, and a Cornish title, and a Cornish title.
St. Pyramus Day this week.
And at the same time, look at the Six Nations. The first internationals are between England and Scotland. And then you add Ireland and then you add Wales. So we've never been a unitary people. You see, I think it's why we're wandering off a bit here, but I think it's why we're so good at handling immigration, because we've always had multiple identities. You are Scots and you're British, you're English and you're British.
Some identities have been associated with the far right, the English St George's flag, wrongly.
Only if you're Emily Thornberry, other such... I mean, again, isn't it odd, all of these people have just vanished. Emily Thornberry has faded away like some cursed Cassandra, Boris really sort of... I always think it's like a transformation scene in Baroque opera, Boris descends naked and covered in silver paint in a boat, waves a magic wand, and all these dark figures just vanish.
How does Boris compare with your historical long view, David Starkey? Let's put clothes on him. Let's ignore that. The vision
that disturbing image. That very disturbing image.
Is he a Churchill? Is he?
I gave a lecture which goes down extremely well, as all my lectures do. You'll not be surprised to hear, which is called Boris Johnson: Churchill, Charles II or Coco the Clown. And I don't think any of them quite work. Churchill, the coup that he carried out, he or Cummings carried out last November, December, is one of the great political coups, the persuading the turkeys of the zombie parliament.
The Liberal Democrats and SNP.
The Liberal and key SNP to vote for suicide, to vote for Christmas, was truly remarkable, the way the general election campaign carried it off. But I think, you see, and this again takes us to the other, if you like, non-constitutional reason for Brexit. Boris, the figure that he really resembles, at least I hope he does, that the situation that we're in now objectively resembles, is Disraeli. Who is the man who invents the Tory party and is the man who fundamentally benefits and helps to create the great realignment of politics.
The One Nation Tory.
The One Nation Tory.
He would love you saying this.
It is true.
This is what he wants to be.
It's true. Well, the One Nation Toryism, that's not quite it. It's Disraeli who talks about the two nations and the need to unite them. The person who actually coins the phrase one nation is later. It's another very important figure, but we've not time to talk about him. Stanley Baldwin in the early 20th century. He actually coins the phrase one nation. But what Disraeli recognises is, if you like, he recognises Workington man. He recognises the working class vote, especially in the north, and is fundamentally, and this is the key thing, it's fundamentally patriotic. This is why, of course, Corbyn was Boris's absolute ideal opponent, a man who doesn't like his own country, who is ashamed and disgusted by his own country, and that was the ideal opponent. And again, the modern Labour Party is the embodiment of international liberalism, which is Disraeli understands. Disraeli is a product, you see, of a world. We think of the Victorians as very different. The Victorians are undergoing exactly what we are undergoing now. They're undergoing the first gigantic stages of globalization. The early industrial revolution is this gigantic revolution which internationalizes, which creates a new elite class, which creates an increasing gap between rich and poor and all the rest of it. And Disraeli is the one who understands that and comprehends it politically and jumps on it politically in exactly the way that Cummings and Boris did this time round. The two are genuinely astonishing achievements. Boris merely takes advantage of the disenchantment of the northern voter with the Labour Party. Disraeli does something even more fundamental. He actually gives the franchise to the working man.
Yes. Just finally, before we have a quick pause in our discussion, David Starkey, what do you make of the current calibre of politicians? I know that everyone gets younger as we get older, but you once said they were overpaid and underemployed. Do you stand by that?
Generally, I think it's not surprising. That's to say that if you look at Disraeli or a Gladstone or a Peel, if you were Prime Minister of Great Britain, you effectively ruled the world. If you look at the scale, we were talking about buildings, right? I was talking about Westminster. Go and look at the scale of the Victorian buildings in Whitehall. Look at the Foreign Office. Look at that office of the Foreign Secretary. Palmerston ran the world.
But the modern calibre, I mean, what I think about Brexit is that our civil servants MPs can't hide behind the nanny's apron strings of the EU anymore. They've got to do it for themselves. If you believe that a third of all rules were decided in Brussels, well, it's all
they're
now.
going to have to,
so they have to work harder, aren't they?
They're actually going to have to take responsibility for fundamental policy.
Everything.
And again, I think it's very striking. The civil service itself was, I think, fundamental, and this is not suggesting they're disloyal or anything else, but they're part of that same worldview of international values, human rights, freedom of trade, liberalism. It's exactly what Disraeli reacted against. It's exactly what, as it were, made the Tory party, as it emerged in the late 19th century, so different. You see, the points of comparison are absolute. What was it that split the old pre-Disraeli Conservative Party? It was freedom of trade. It was the Corn Laws, which is exactly the equivalent of the Tories taking us
and Jackie Rees-Mogg used that in the
taking us into the EU. And if you like, what Boris is doing now is reenacting that Disraelian role. But there is a huge problem, Chris, before we stop. They have not yet got a language. Disraeli had a brilliant grasp of language. Disraeli talks perfectly open. Listen to the phrases. The Conservative Party is a national party, or it is nothing. I am on the side of the people. I am on the side of the people against liberalism. Now, come on. When is Boris going to do that? Because there's a terrible problem. I think Boris and the future Mrs. Boris are closet liberals.
No one heard that. It was whispered very quietly. Well, on that bombshell, to call Boris Johnson a liberal, we'll be back right after this.
Go beyond the headlines with the Telegraph's daily coronavirus podcast, a roundup of the latest news on the pandemic from our leading journalists, with analysis on the impact on health, business and travel every weekday evening. Search Coronavirus the Latest on your podcast app.
Right, we're back here on a Choppers Politics extra special episode with David Starkey, the historian. David, taking me back to a young David Starkey. You were born in 1945 in Cumbria to a poor family, suffered from polio, had 2 club feet, which led to painful operations. How did that experience shape you?
Meant I've got short legs. Do you know what? I've got a huge belief that with that kind of thing, either it makes you or it breaks you. I hate victimhood. I hate parading victimhood. I hate people who plead that because they come from a poor family, they should be let into good universities with lower grades. In my day, you just came top of the class. It's as simple as that. So I suppose in one sense, not in one sense, it toughens you.
But doesn't that perpetuate inequality?
What?
Just if you went to a good school and got a good grade, you'll beat the young guy from the poorer school.
No, you won't. If the young guy from the poorer school, well, mine wasn't a poor school in those days. We had grammar schools. It was a very good school. If the poorer guy is brighter than you are, works harder than you are, is leaner and hungrier than you are, he will wipe the floor with you, which is exactly what me and my fellows from grammar schools did with effete public school boys in the Tripos results of 1967. We needed no excuses. I'm sorry, there was much that was brutal and horrible about Thatcher and horrible about Thatcherism, and the new Toryism is correctly breaking with it. But equally, that sense of cutting through a soft, rather fruity upper-class cake was vital.
And you're part of that, the knife
blade. Very
blade.
much part of that.
You never want to mince your words. What do you say to people who say you're rude?
I am at times, but I never listen. On the whole, I never resort to mere insult, to sexual denigration and that kind of thing. I very often will use words in a fashion which is intended to hurt, particularly in my days on the moral maze, and sometimes I'm proud of them, sometimes I'm a bit ashamed of them. I invented a kind of verbal caricature. There was the unfortunate George Austen, who was the Archdeacon of York, which is nothing like as important as it sounds, who was very fond of moralising about poor Prince Charles and his marital breakdown. And we had him in the moral maze on one occasion, and he pontificated insufferably. And as he left, I came up to the microphone, just as I did at the end of our previous half, and came up and said, "Doesn't his fatness, his smugness and his pomposity genuinely make you want to vomit?" And but you see, it's a verbal caricature.
That's staying.
You can see the man. I am then ashamed to say, before he died, he wrote a letter of reconciliation. Oh. And what was really awful, and come on, let's doubleness, it featured as the principal item in both his Times and his Telegraph obituary.
Did it?
And do you know what? I felt ashamed.
Did you?
Yes.
Because you didn't make friends with them after making a point?
I didn't make proper amends, but also that I suppose is the final indignity, that the caricature becomes the person, and there is a cruelty in that.
And there's a lesson there, is that always, if you say something a bit harsh, perhaps get in touch later and say, "I didn't mean it," or "Let's be friends."
The trouble is, I did mean it.
Yes, that's the problem. You did mean it.
I did mean it. I suppose the real answer is not to have such a tender conscience, but there we are.
Yes. Well, you might be surprising to some listeners that you have said your politics remained essentially in the middle of the road, Labour left until the end of the 1970s.
Absolutely.
And then you became a Thatcherite?
I
swapped
right? Pretty sharply. I mean, I think, again, middle of the road Labour, I think, until the Heath government. The Heath government, and this is the real moment of shame in my life, inspired me to vote Liberal.
Right.
I mean, after
Jeremy
him...
Thorpe's party.
And that was not because of an affinity with Mr. Thorpe, I hasten to say. No, the 1970s were a truly awful period, and what everybody says about 1979 is true. And anybody who's lived through that, I think, anybody with any sense, would find voting Labour very difficult indeed. On the other hand, as I said, Thatcherism is not without huge problems. And I think what we should all be doing now, as we have the beginning of what we hope will be a new Conservative hegemony, is recognising what the problems were. And they actually go back as always, to the Heath government, to the catastrophe of the Heath government. You see, I think the Keith Joseph local government reforms of they're implemented in 73, aren't they, are genuinely a disaster. This constant worship of big...
That was unitary
authorities.
We got rid of Westmoreland, Cumberland.
That's right, were fused. The abolition of serious county authorities, Again, one of the things that's very interesting, if you look at the way the North voted, and several people have been highlighting this, the cities on the whole remained Labour. It's the towns. And it was the towns, the Halifaxes and the Huddersfields, that suffered in the Joseph reforms. These have been proud, self-governing communities. Look at Rochdale Town Hall. Look at the
chimes,
the magnificent buildings of Halifax and its Wool Market and all the rest of it. These are places of supreme self-confidence. And suddenly they find themselves not even governing themselves. And I think this is something we are going to have to look at really hard. There's got to be, I think, a revival of proper local government. It's what both France has and America has. We desperately need it.
Would you go back to the old historical county names? Now, there's a campaign that often features in the Telegraph pages of returning back to those county names.
I would, because
people do talk about themselves living in counties.
You come from Lancashire, you come from Yorkshire. I mean, these are names which, again, go back to the absolute foundations of England. Most of them are pre-Norman. They resonate profoundly. And again, you see, I spent a lot of time in America. I've got a house there. And what is striking is national government in America cannot, and I will use a technical phrase, bugger up local government. It can't touch it. And this, I think, is really, really important. My little town, founded in Chestertown, founded in the early 18th century, the courthouse is where the courthouse always has been. They haven't knocked it down. They haven't sold it off. They haven't turned it into a coffee bar. They haven't Thatcherized it. We've got our own little local police force, and the place runs itself. And there is and I think you notice in America, not true of many of the big cities, but certainly in that middle world of America, there's a much stronger sense of local identity and proper local self-government. We've got to get that back.
And that matters, doesn't it?
Hugely.
Do you think that would cement Brexit as a
Yes.
thing if they did do that? I mean, went back to the old historical boundaries and counties?
I think that certainly the re-enfranchising of substantial towns like Hull, Huddersfield, whatever, and giving them back that self-government, making their town halls the places from which they're run again, renaming again. Look at constituencies. These weird non-names. They have no meaning, and place matters. Again, the terrific maiden speech of Danny Kruger about place, about identity. This is, the man who is the prefigurer of Disraeli is, of course, a man who'd actually been on the relative left of politics, a bit like me, I suppose, Edmund Burke. But Burke is passionate about identities, about belongings, about institutions.
And those things have been destroyed, haven't they? I mean, if you believe in the four pillars of communities, GP surgery, post office, pub, school, when one or the two of those goes, the community dies.
You see, we're touching now utterly fundamental problems. Thatcherism was only marginally conservative. It's a form of economic radical liberalism, which means that the only thing that matters is money. And it was disguised by Thatcher's patriotism. It was disguised by the necessary struggle with socialism and whatever. But a real conservatism has to be different. A real conservatism has to recognise the importance of community, of belonging. And I think it's got to take advantage. I mean, one of the things that I think is wonderful about this government is you look at the number of non-English faces around the cabinet table. But these are people...
But they're all English, David, aren't they?
They're not. All right, let's call them white British.
Okay.
These are my fellow citizens and your fellow citizens, and we should be highly proud of the fact. But what is remarkable is, I think, all of them are people that I would call bicultural. They are completely comfortable in their skins of whatever colour and their own cultures, but they're also part of our national culture. And I encountered this first, again, the moral maze is one of the great formative moments for me with my fellow panellist, a man called Hugo Gryn. And Hugo and I had a pretty tense relationship often. There was a wonderful exchange between us when Hugo said to me, David, you're not half as nasty as you appear, to which I responded, Hugo, you're not half as nice either, which was a very good reply. But anyway, we became very good friends. He took myself and my partner James round. We even went to Passover and whatever. And suddenly I saw this man who was a an English public figure participating in, important debate on Radio 4 and all the rest, suddenly in the role of a kind of Jewish priest. Those extraordinary rituals going back 2,500 years or whatever it is that take place over the table, which is during the preparation of food and eating of food, which of course is why Judaism is indestructible, because it doesn't actually need synagogues. It doesn't need...
It just carries on at home.
It carries on at home. And I think that we are seeing, and in fact I would almost come up with a definition, successful immigrants are Tories. And they are warm to... They're warm to the continuing traditions and oddities and quirks.
Isn't that an extraordinary thing to say? I mean, given the debate about immigration, the debate about the points-based system.
We're now seeing it. Look at the number who are in high office. We should be boasting about this.
This is people who are British but have come from a few generations ago were somewhere else.
They're usually second generation. And it's astonishing.
And we should celebrate that, should we?
Absolutely. We've done it 5 times as fast as America. Throwing all this back, I think it's essentially we can do this because of the oddity of the notion of being British. The fact that it's always incorporated, different traditions, which actually at some points are sort of fisticuffs with each other, like being English and Scots. And watch that lot at Murrayfield. Yes,
yes, quite. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that someone once said, and you've always held on to it, that I suppose David Starkey is the least boring historian in Cambridge. Is that what drives you on, not being boring?
Yes, and actually that suddenly has become very touching. The man who said that was a student of mine, Charles Kitchen, and he is responsible for the fact that I had a television career. He was asked to choose, pick a historian, this is way back in 1977, to take part in what was clearly, we now understand, the first reality TV in Britain, and we were there, as experts were there as a kind of fig leaf on the extraordinary conversations of these real-life inhabitants of Coronation Street, which were about food and sex.
What was this?
This behave yourself. Food and sex and clothes and sex. It was extraordinary. We had 96% audience share. It was quite staggering. But I learned yesterday that dear Charles, though he was my student, has just died. And so it's really nice to be able to pay a tribute to him. Again, it's one of the great prides of having been a university teacher for as long as I was. You have students who are at least as good as you are. You have students with whom your life interweaves. You have students who become close friends. And as somebody who never had children, that matters.
It certainly does. David Starkey, to prove my theory that you have an opinion on just about everything, I was wondering if you could quickly summarise your thoughts on a few random topics. Do you have time for this?
Carry on.
Hilary Mantel, the fictional version of David Starkey.
Oh, no, she's not. She is clearly, I mean, I've never read the stuff, but she is clearly a very substantial novelist in every sense of the word.
Joe Biden, of course.
Trump is so brilliant, Sleepy Joe. The only person who had Alzheimer's before he became president rather than afterwards. Yes.
MPs' salaries, they got a 3% pay rise just recently.
You see,
81,000 a year
I think
now.
it's absurd. MPs are fundamentally of no importance. The backbench MP is a creature of no importance.
You can't tell them that.
I'm saying it now. Very few MPs matter. What we should be doing is we should encourage people to have other jobs. MPs should at most receive part-time pay. The more we've tried to produce a professional class of MPs, the worse they've got.
So give them all second jobs. I would pay them half.
I would. It's essentially a part-time job. Otherwise, they become full-time social workers, and we have real social workers, and they just get in the way.
Gay marriage.
I was very sceptical. Cameron put forward a good argument for it, which was that marriage is such a good thing that everybody should be entitled to it. This is a relic, Chris, of my very early radical days. I was right back in the early 70s. I was out when it was very unfashionable, long before the Ian McKellens of this world and the Matthew Parises. And I took the view at that point that being gay is fundamentally different from being heterosexual, and we make different patterns of life and have different values. I'm not sure anymore that that's true. My own experience of 23 years of of living with somebody and his premature death forced me to reassess a lot of those things. So for once, actually, Chris, I won't be so confident in the answer I give you.
Yes. Were you married or in a civil partnership?
We never did. He wanted to...
For tax reasons?
No. I refused both. Because I always argued that gay relationships had no social consequences in the ordinary sense of the word. There were no children. So they didn't need state legitimation.
And some want that, though, don't they?
You see, this again is the point. Many people, and I think in retrospect, I should probably have heeded what James wanted. They want public recognition. They want the acknowledgement of the importance of the bond, and of course, seeing off the taxman, which he was very keen on. Fortunately, it didn't much matter, but no. In the circumstances.
So James wanted marriage, and you didn't.
I didn't. I mean, as I said, in retrospect, I regret it.
The voting age. Should it be 16? 18 is...
I think 18 is actually too low. I mean, but think about it. We are... all the usual signs of maturity, like marriage, like partnering, like acquiring property, get later and later and later. We are living longer and longer and longer. People have prolonged teenage. My own lasted till I was about 40. And... we should be looking at this.
How high would you raise it?
I would have it at least 21.
21 at least, going back to as it was.
As it was, and this seems to me to be entirely reasonable. Again, people say, "Oh, well, we require people to die for." Or we don't. We actually don't require because we don't conscript. But people are able to die for their country younger.
At 16,
being at 16, you're cannon fodder. That's a very different question from being a responsible citizen.
Correct. A third runway at Heathrow, David Starkey.
Boris is right on this one. Heathrow is a planning disaster, a catastrophe. It's a great shame that he didn't have the courage of his convictions, scrap HS2 and build Boris Island.
Yes, well, but where there are too many geese out there,
bugger the geese, yes.
Marmite.
Hate it.
Cream before jam or jam before cream on a scone?
I always put jam on first because otherwise the jam sloshes off the cream. Yes, and by the way, I try to avoid it because I have a figure that does. My figure is very sensitive to sugar. It goes woof.
Yes. Milk before tea or tea before milk?
Oh, I'm a working class lad. The reason that you put the milk in first is that it was usually off.
Yes. It also caramelizes slightly when the water hits it, and it can give it a slightly sweeter edge.
Yeah.
Are humans better at creation or destruction, David Starkey?
There's a time for one and a time for the other. The wonderful phrase in the title, in the Bible, a time to build up and a time to tear down, a time to love and a time to hate.
In equal measure?
A time to make peace and a time to make war. Absolutely.
In equal measure, there's a yin and yang there.
And again, as a conservative, you are fundamentally on the side of the building up. But equally, things have to change. No conservative can simply wed him or herself to keeping things absolutely the same as they were. The technique, the genius is, if like Disraeli, you understand what is good reform and what is bad reform. Bad reform is when it's according to universalist liberal principles like the Human Rights Act or the separation of powers. This leads to disaster. Good reform is when you go along, as Disraeli did, with the traditions of parliamentary representation, and so you broaden it.
You don't want a written constitution. There was talk about last
I think
last
the point is we couldn't have one because there would be no agreement. We're in a stage of fundamental constitutional division, which represents fundamental political division. Our only chance, I think, is to stabilise the existing constitution, see if, in my view, is that it actually, generally speaking, works very well. I mean, if you want to look at the rewards of liberal universalism, look at Israel. Third election in how many months? Because of proportional representation. Because you cannot get a majority. I mean, look at the state. Look at the state that you're going to be in Ireland, where you're actually giving, through proportional representation, the majority to a party with blood on its hands and gunpowder on its bottom.
That's in the past, they would argue, wouldn't they?
That's not true. It is not true. Its endorsement of very recent terrorism, the evident involvement of continuing involvement of people whose terrorist past is acknowledged, is undeniable.
If you could go back to any point in history as a historian, what would it be? Where are you happiest?
The whole point, well, now, because of modern dentistry and modern medicine, the whole point about being a historian, you haven't understood it. It's not going back. People like Hilary Mantel imagine they can go back. That's why they write fiction. The historian does something else. He uses the evidence he's got, and he teases it out, and he teases it, and that wonderful phrase of Francis Bacon, that you put it to the question, you torture it. You torture the evidence
on
to
the
extract
rack.
on the rack, or even nastier if you can come up with it, to extract the information from it. That's the genius of the historian. It's what you have in common with astronomers. Astronomers can't actually affect the evidence that they're looking at, because obviously it's out there, it's millions of years ago. That's what the historian is doing. That's its intellectual excitement. That's its satisfaction. That's why I'm here now.
On that note, David Starkey, thank you very much for joining me.
A pleasure.
Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this special edition of Chopper's Politics with David Starkey, recorded before the coronavirus lockdown. It's like the Archers, no mention of COVID-19. It's bizarre to think how much has changed in such a short period of time. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what we discussed. Do you agree with David that MPs should be paid half as much and that the voting age should go up to 21? Leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or email us chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter, if you don't already of course. We're @ChoppersPodcast. Huge thanks of course to David Starkey, our guest this week, and to the show's producers Louisa Wells and Theo Luludis. And finally, above all, thank you to you for listening. Now normally right now I would tell you to go and buy a copy of the Telegraph. You won't regret it. Well, that's always true, but if you work for the NHS, you can get a free 6-month digital subscription to the Telegraph, and who doesn't love a freebie? So I'll put details of how to access that in the show notes to this episode. Everyone else, as usual, can get 30 days free of charge by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. Until next time, cheerio!